Hey everyone, hope you're all having a great day today. We're going to be back here with another rapid game on chess.com. Let's go ahead and see if we can get a good opponent and get a good game here. Alright, so our game here against Lavad Antian, rated 1691. We're going to go ahead and play the Sicilian in this particular game. So e4, c5, knight f3. I'm going to go for e6, kind of go for more of a Taimanov type of approach. Trade on d4, knight c6, queen c7 is the setup I'm going to kind of aim towards, assuming that he plays d4 here. If he doesn't play d4, we'll probably still go knight c6. Okay, he does play d4 though, so let's go ahead and trade. Knight will take back most likely. I'll go knight c6, queen to c7, probably a6, knight f6, bishop b4, stuff along those lines. Now, against this move c4, when white plays this very early on, there are some... there is kind of an interesting approach that's available here. Not necessarily a trap, but a kind of situation that can put white under some pressure if he's not careful and doesn't know exactly what to do. Queen h4 is a bit of an interesting option here. It looks a bit almost like a, maybe a beginner would kind of play it. You bring the queen out early and you're just simply attacking a pawn, but it is a little bit difficult for white to defend the pawn for a long time. Queen h4. If he goes knight c3, I have bishop b4 pinning the knight. If he goes bishop d3, I can take the knight on d4. The more normal way to play here against white's Maroczy bind that he's got set up is just to go queen c7, a6, knight f6, like I was saying. But because he's done this move order, I'm actually going to play this kind of interesting option here. So simply threatening to take the pawn. He also needs to keep the knight protected, so he can't do like queen e2, for example, because I'll just win the knight for free. Also, if he takes the knight on c6, I can take with check first, and then capture the knight back after that. So knight c3 is kind of the typical move here. Knight to b5 is another option that's kind of interesting. The idea being white gives up the pawn, but then black has to be a bit careful on how to protect against the c7 fork. So if he did knight b5, queen takes, queen e2, for example, I'd have to maybe trade queens and then maybe play something like king d8, or I'd have to be a little careful on how to protect the c7 fork there. But the tricky thing is, if you've never run into this position before as white, you're already thinking on your own on move 5, move 6 or so, and he's probably used to a more normal type of Sicilian setup, but he's got to figure some things out here. Queen d3 is another option as well. That way it protects the knight and the pawn at the same time. Queen d3 does potentially run into knight b4 ideas, and then white has to be a bit careful about where he puts the queen. Queen d3 also, I just have knight f6 or bishop b4 check, ideas like that. Queen d3, even bishop c5, because if the knight moves, I have queen takes f2. So if it was like queen d3, bishop c5, bishop e3, maybe then I can go knight b4, and then it's going to be hard for the queen to keep the pawn protected. So there's a lot of little tactical traps in this kind of setup. Usually for this reason, if white's going to want to get the Maroczy bind here, especially against knight c6, what he's going to want to do here is something like, at least maybe a more safe move order would be something like bishop e2 first maybe, and then playing c4. Or he can alternatively play maybe c4 here, and then maybe d4 later. But this queen h4 move is kind of a bit unusual for sure, but definitely a bit of an interesting option here that white's got to figure out what to do against. So we do have about a 2-minute time advantage, which compared to some of the other videos is not typically how it works. So like I said, I think this most solid move order is to play knight c3, bishop b4. I think maybe white there can play maybe then queen d3 because there's no knight b4 ideas anymore. If he goes knight c3 and I go bishop c5 right now, he just goes bishop e3, and I can't take the pawn or anything because the knight's protecting it. So I think knight to b5 and knight to c3 are the two main moves here. if he does queen to d3, I think, like I said, bishop c5, then knight b4, and it's a little tough to guard that pawn. So he's on his, he's got his thinking cap on. Another option here, another option entirely, is actually to just take on c6. Queen takes, bishop e2, I take back, and then white just castles. And white's kind of arguing there at that point that he's ahead in development, so it's okay if he's down a pawn. That's also a playable option as well. It's a bit more double-edged because black is, you know, being up a pawn but behind on development. If I can kind of just survive there as black and untangle and get developed, then I'm going to be better with the extra pawn. So he does do knight c3, one of the better options, I would say, against queen h4, but bishop b4 is still the idea here, simply threatening to take the pawn. He does play queen to d3. Like I said, this is probably the more preferable move order, though there are still some problems that white has to solve that we'll see here. So what I can do now is knight f6, piling up on the pawn more, threatening to take it due to the pin here. If I try to do knight takes d4, then knight f6, he can throw in the move bishop d3, and then I don't really have anything special going on there necessarily. Though in that kind of position, if knight takes, queen takes, knight f6, bishop d3, I do have like d6 and bishop c5 as a threat. But if I don't make a threat, I always have to worry about white playing g3 and my queen kind of being a little bit awkward. So I'm actually going to go knight f6 here. I think this is kind of the more typical response. Threatening to play queen takes e4, queen takes, and the knight's pinned here. If he goes knight to b5 now, I might just castle, because now I can castle and get out of the center. So it actually ends up that, you know, I'm the one that's a little bit in ahead development at the moment, and I'm constantly making threats. Notice he can't play f3 in any variation because of the pin, so that's another thing that makes this a little bit tricky for white. So he does take on c6. I'm going to take back with the... I think it's a bit more typical to take back with the d pawn. If you take back with the b pawn, it's going to be kind of awkward for this bishop on c8. But I kind of want to double check this. Another option here is to throw in the move bishop takes c3. Because if white takes back with the queen, I can take here with check and win a pawn. If he takes back with the pawn, then he does have a bad pawn structure. But there is some compensation there in the form of, once I take back, he has maybe like bishop a3 ideas, and castling is tough to do. But at the very least, I could, you know, I could just take on e4 and be up a pawn there. If I do d takes, e5 is an option. But then there's this move queen e4 check, which is annoying, forking the king and the pawn on e5. If he trades queens, I take back, and the knight on c3 is gonna, the pawn structure is gonna get messed up for white there. So the question is it b takes or d takes? I think I'm leaning towards d takes, but do I want to take on c3 first or d takes first? Bishop takes, pawn takes, d takes, e5, queen e4 check. That variation's not as good because after take, I take the knight, e5, check. He does have queen e2. That way he doesn't have to give me the e4 square for the knight just yet. So I think I am going to take here. I'm going to kind of keep this bishop on the board because it might even be useful in some bishop c5 ideas. But the threat right now is to take the pawn due to the pin. So he misses this idea. His best move, I think, was e5 there. But he misses this idea. He doesn't see that the knight's still pinned. So I can still just play queen takes e4. The knight can't take. I take back with my knight. I'm simply up a pawn, and I still have the bishop pair. I'm going to have actually more than the bishop pair if I take on d2 here. I'm going to have the bishop pair versus his bishop and knight combo. I could take on c3 as well. Take on c3, maybe bishop takes back or pawn takes back, and then just work on playing like e5, bishop e6, you know, and getting all my pieces activated in the game. That's also perfectly fine to play. Knight takes here, king takes. I'm a little bit more of a fan of that just because I get the bishop pair, which is pretty pleasant. But I could take on c3 and give him double pawns and a weaker pawn structure, which is also pretty pleasant. So this is a little bit of a decision to make. Do I take on c3 or do I take on d2 here? I could even do bishop takes c3 because then that way I'm guaranteeing that I'm going to get rid of this bishop no matter what. If I do knight takes c3, he could do pawn takes. I move away, and then Even there, though, that still looks very good for me. Bishop ties him down to f2, e5, bishop e6, going after this pawn. Yeah, I think I like the approach, especially here in the endgame of giving... I'm already up a pawn. I might as well give him more weak pawns that I can target as well. So I think for that reason, I'm going to take on c3. I'm just trying to decide, do I use the knight or the bishop here? Because if I take with the bishop, whether he takes back with the pawn or bishop, I can still take on c3 or take on d2 anyways. So the question is, do I want this bishop off the board? Because these guys are already going to disappear. Do I want this bishop on d2 off the board? If I do this, that still looks good for me. The other question, I guess, is if I take on c3 and he takes back, and then I take here, do I want the king on d2 with him able to play rook e1 ideas? Not necessarily, because if I do it this way, and then I try to play that e5 move, he can play rook e1, f6, f4, and I'm under a little bit of pressure there because I might have some trouble developing this bishop here. So I actually don't want to play bishop takes c3. I kind of want to do knight takes c3 a bit more. So I'm going to go for that option here. I'm going to take on c3 with the knight. And then we're going to trade here. And now I'm going to play a move e5 to play bishop e6. One move he could play here that's annoying is rook b1, tying me down to protecting the pawn. But, well, if that happens, we might just have to kind of figure things out at that point. e5, rook b1. If I go b6, he goes bishop g2, hitting this pawn. I gotta be a little careful there. If he just castles, then I'll play bishop e6, and I'm fairly happy with that. Even there, though, e5, castle, bishop e6. He has rook e1, hitting the pawn, f6, and then an f4, trying to take advantage of my pawn setup there. Another idea here is to play maybe c5, but the problem with that is that he'll play bishop g2 and rook b1 and just tie me down to protecting this pawn pretty easily. But c5, b6, bishop a6 is another way to activate the bishop. I also have bishop d7 and queenside castling. That might actually solve a lot of problems here, because then I can still play c5 later on, or e5. E5 right now has a little bit of trouble, like I'm saying, with castling and then rook e1 and f6 ideas. Or, sorry, f6, f4 ideas. Okay, so this is going to seem... if I go bishop d7, though, c5, he can kind of keep that pawn on a dark square, which makes things a little trickier for me. He can kind of play c5 almost no matter what I do. So if I go c5, bishop g2, I could walk the king over here, or play rook b8, b6, trade off the bishops. Yeah, it's a little bit of an interesting spot here. I'm up a pawn with the better pawn structure, so I'm definitely better here. So I'm obviously working towards a win, but I want to just not let him get too much activity somehow. So I have to be a little careful. I don't really want to castle because I might as well have the king on e7, which covers a lot of the d-file points. So maybe king e7 right now, and then just rook d8. Maybe I trade off one pair of rooks or something like that. Even b6 right now, bishop g2, bishop maybe b7, and then queenside castling. That also looks okay. I think I'm leaning towards this c5 idea. It looks a little odd to open the bishop up, but I'm kind of leaning towards not letting him play c5. Because if he gets to play c5, maybe, you know, it makes it harder for me to move my b pawn. It makes this a bit more of a target. If I can play c5 and b6, I don't really have any targets at this point. So yeah, I'm going to go c5. Probably next move, rook b8, then b6, depending on what he does. Or even b6 right away. If he goes bishop g2 after that, rook b8, he might throw in a check. I might be able to trade bishops or something. Okay, so he does pin the pawn. I'm going to go rook b8. That was kind of my my intention right here. I want to play b6 and bishop a6, really. That's like ideally what I want to do. I think before I rush into that, I might even run the king over to c7 first. If I go b6, there is this a4 move, which is a little bit annoying. But then I can still play bishop a6, so that pawn's hard to guard. So maybe that's not too big of a deal. Yes, let's go b6 with bishop a6 being the plan. The main difference between this idea of attacking the pawn versus this one is that I'm going to try to not have the pawn on e5 being a target. I'm trying to remove targets, essentially. Now, if I go bishop a6, he does have bishop c6 check, which is on the annoying side of things. So I'm actually going to go king e7 first, then rook to d8, look to trade off a pair of rooks, then bishop a6, something like that. Also, now bishop c6 is not a check, so I can go bishop a6, threatening the pawn. If he goes here, then I can play rook d8. So bishop a6, if he goes a5, that's a little tricky, actually. Bishop a6, a5. I take the pawn, he takes, rook a7 check is a bit annoying for sure. So maybe I do play rook d8 to offer a trade first. And if he ever plays a5, I could maybe play... Well, even there, it's a little annoying. I could play a5 myself right now. My pawns stay on dark squares, which means his bishop can't attack them. I keep his pawns on light squares. So yeah, I actually like that idea. I do weaken my b6 pawn, so he could now try to go double up and attack it, which is what he looks like he's trying to do. But I kind of beat him to the punch a little bit here with bishop a6, because he has to guard that pawn, I think. Bishop a6, if he goes to double, he could win the b pawn pretty quickly. Bishop a6, if he goes to double. I could, though, just go rook d8. He goes to protect it. I go rook d6 and guard it. And then, again, he's tied down to protecting this, and I can always run my king over. So I think I'll go here, threaten the pawn. Bishop f1 is the only way to protect it that I see. If he goes bishop c6, going for this check. Okay, so he doesn't do that. Now I'm going to go... I want my king on c7 so that I'm not having a rook tied to protecting the pawn. So let's go... I'm going to go rook d8. Essentially, if I can trade off all of these rooks, I'll have the better endgame for sure. I'll have two targets. I'll be up a pawn. I'll be able to kind of go back and forth between tying him down to protecting these. And then once his bishop is stuck on something like b3 protecting both of these pawns, then I'll be able to use my kingside pawn majority 4 versus 3 on the king side. So that's kind of the grand plan here. So let's go rook d8, offering the first trade of rooks. If he takes, I'll take back with the king, run over, go to d8. He avoids the trade. I'm still going to run the king over because I still want to have this pawn protected. I could go rook d2. That would also be okay, but then he might... Well, even there, yeah. If I go rook d2, he goes to double. I can run the king over real quick. That's not an issue. So let's get the rook active. Run the king over to protect the pawn. And we can also play rook a2 to hit this. Stuff like that. I'm not necessarily in a rush to get this pawn because I don't want him to win the b pawn. I don't think. If I go here, there, take... He take, bishop takes c4. I guess that still looks good, actually. I could actually just run forward for this. Rook a2, rook b1, take. Bishop takes c4 there, because the rook's aiming towards c4. If he trades, take. If he ever throws a check, I can play king f6. I'll be up 1, 2, 6. I'll be up 2 pawns at that point, and he'll be tied down to protecting c3. So I think that's going to be good. Part of the question is, do I need to do that? I don't necessarily have to play in that way. You really only want to do that if you were completely sure that white wasn't getting too much counterplay. I could simply play king d6, c7. I go king d6, he hits the pawn. I go to c7 to protect it. And then rook a2 is still a big threat. I could essentially win the pawn with no danger. If he tried to play rook b2, I could then trade a pair of rooks like my plan was, go to d8, and then just kind of wrap back around with the same exact plan for the most part. But I think it does work out to go rook a2 here and just win the pawns right away. Here, take, oops, take, bishop takes, and then I'm up 2 pawns with the passed A pawn, which is pretty useful. I think I'm going to go for that. I'll probably analyze the other line after the game's over. So let's go for this. Okay, so this is essentially a forced sequence here. I can't protect my pawn, so let's take here. He'll take on b6, I assume, and then he'll take back. Take on c4. If he avoids the trade, I can play rook a. Okay, yeah, he can't really avoid the trade because I can still play rook a1, and he can he'd have some trouble there. So he can't really avoid the trade. I'm going to do all of this. He hits this pawn. The question is, if I take on c3 and he takes on a5, am I able to just win using this pawn? I probably can. It'll be a bit tricky because my rook's in front of the pawn, but with my extra pawn, it should be good. I could also... Oh, okay, he just ends up resigning. Okay, that makes things a little easier. I wasn't entirely sure if I would play a4 or just take the pawn right away and then activate the king. But yeah, I think we're completely winning here for the most part. So let's go ahead and analyze this one. Okay, so e4, c5, knight f3, e6. We have the trade of pawns, knight c6, c4. And like I said during the game, there are plenty of other playable moves other than queen h4 here. You could simply play a more normal Sicilian with queen c7, knight f6, a6, stuff like that would all be perfectly fine. You can knight f6 right now, knight c3, queen c7, or bishop's b4. Stuff like that's perfectly fine. I went for queen h4, and he does play knight c3, bishop b4. He plays queen to d3. I do attack the pawn. One of the other variations I was looking at was like, I think it was if he had done queen to d3 right away. I think the idea here is bishop to... I think it's bishop to c5, bishop to e3, knight to b4. The queen moves somewhere, and then I'm able to pick up the e4 pawn. So something like this looks fairly pleasant. I'm behind on development, so I have to be very careful about that. But I am threatening, to take on d4 followed by knight c2. Threatening just to develop a piece and castle if he tries to do this kind of stuff. I think I can actually ignore this threat and just take here. And then go for knight c2 check. He might get the fork. I get the fork. It does get very messy though. He could take back here and stop the fork, but now I don't have to worry about knight c7 anymore. So that's one of the lines we were looking at. I think knight c3 is probably the most solid move. Knight to b5 was another one, but this does have the inherent downside of losing the pawn right away. White goes queen e2. If I trade queens here, I do have to solve this issue of the c7 fork, so that's a little bit tricky. King to d8 is playable, but this gets a bit annoying for sure. But I am up a pawn, so again, if I can untangle and keep the extra pawn, I'll be pretty good. He did knight c3 though. We make the pin, queen to d3. Maybe knight b5 is the response here, but I think I would still play like queen takes e4. He blocks. I do this to stop the check. It gets a bit messy, I will say. g3 and bishop f4 is a bit of an issue, but after queen b8, bishop f4, e5, I'm going to play a6 next move and kick the knight once the bishop moves away. And I think black's just got black's up a pawn with the better position here. But white's got some compensation with some weak squares he can use. Anyways, though, so in the game, queen d3, knight f6 takes the pawn. Takes the knight, I mean. I took back. I do think e5 is one of the better options. Bishop d2 is actually a move as well. If he had done e5, I think the plan's to check. If he trades here, we kind of get a version of the game where I'm piling up on the pinned knight. And I'm not up a pawn like I was in the game, but it's kind of similar. If he does bishop d2, we can kind of do the same thing here. Bishop takes c3 or knight takes c3. Kind of similar to the game. I'd probably do almost about the exact same plan. The main difference being I don't have the extra pawn yet, but the pawn structure is still significantly better for black because of all the doubled pawns and weak pawns on the queen side. So that would be like a better version of the game because he wouldn't be down a pawn, but I'd still have the better endgame there for sure. Bishop d2 is another move that works here as well. The idea is if I take on c3, I can't take on e4 because he'll get the g7 pawn. But there is this move here, e5, that's kind of interesting. The idea is if the bishop takes e5, I can maybe go like... Well, actually, I was thinking knight g4, but bishop goes to g3. So maybe e5 is not anything special. Maybe we could still actually do this. Bishop goes back to d4, I play c5, the bishop retreats, maybe b6. He's kind of tied down to defending the pawn. I get this same kind of pawn structure on the queen side. The difference, again, though, is I'm not up a pawn in this case, and white does have the bishop pair. And he also doesn't have weak pawns, but I think black's pieces are placed pretty well. I think this would be kind of more of a back-and-forth game. g3 definitely, though, is a mistake because we're able to just win a pawn right away. He goes to protect it. We took on c3. Maybe I overestimated taking on c3. Now that I'm kind of looking at it, there is this kind of pattern or typical response of like a3 here, which is actually a bit annoying. He doesn't have to take the knight back right away. He could play a3. The idea being, if I move the knight, he just takes the bishop. If I move the bishop, he actually plays the move b4, and both the knight and the bishop are hanging. I could play bishop takes here and then knight e4. And I am still up I'm actually up 2 pawns once again. So this is still better for me for sure. But he at least has the bishop pair. His pawn structure is not as weak. And maybe he has some targets on the queen side. So if he's going to be down 2 pawns, he might as well do it this way. This is probably the better version of what he could have done. So maybe for that reason, taking with the bishop is better. Maybe all of this would have been a better move order. And then going back for like c5, maybe the exact same plan I did in the game. I'm not as big on the move e5 here because of rook e1, f6, f4. This looks a bit awkward for sure, but I don't know. Maybe something like this, you still have a pretty good position, I guess. So I think there's a lot of options that lead to black having the advantage here. I ended up taking on c3. He takes back. We trade. I did the c5 idea. If I had done e5 again, I was slightly worried about something like this. That's mainly what I was worried about, and I felt like I would just lose back my extra pawn, even though I'm still going to maintain the advantage. I wonder if there's anything better than that. If I go bishop g4, rook e1 I feel like it's the same problem. f6, f4 seems like the same issue here. But I don't know. The way I play it, I think, is just solid enough. We prevent any kind of weaknesses. We take away the opponent's counterplay. b6 going for bishop a6. I didn't want to rush bishop a6 just yet because bishop c6 check and the rook gets to d7, which is annoying. So I go here first. If he had played bishop c6, that would stop bishop a6, but I could still just play rook d8 here, and that would be good enough. Trade the rooks, play bishop a6, stuff like that. So he played a4. I played a5. I think a5 is kind of an important move here. I don't want to. Again, I'm trying to take away all the counterplay he might have. If I go bishop a6 and he goes a5, I may win the pawn right away, but this is, this is unnecessarily annoying here. I mean, I would still be better, and then I can just work to push the queenside pawns, but, I'm giving him a lot of counterplay that he probably doesn't need to have. So a6, I think, or a5 is just solid, I think. Rook b1. Maybe his best move was bishop c6 to b5. That would kind of protect all the pawns. But I think I'd probably still have a fairly similar plan of rook d8, trade-off, and then maybe instead of bishop a6, now I go for the e5, bishop e6, rook d8, stuff like that. The bishop will still be tied down to protecting these weaknesses, and then I'll eventually walk the king over and win with my pawn majority on the king side. That's still like the long-term plan at this point. Even if he had maybe guarded the pawns a bit better. So he did rook b1 though. I did bishop a6, bishop f1, rook d8, rook c1. I go rook d2, rook b1, or sorry, rook b3. Yeah, I think what I played in the game is winning material and not giving him too much counterplay. I could have also just done, like I said, king here, he goes here, king here, and then now rook a2 is the threat once again. If he tries to stop that with rook b2, I would trade the rooks, get on the open file. If somehow he's able to, prevent losing material here. I don't know, maybe e5. The bishop can work its way to c6 to hit this. It can go to e6 to hit this. I'm essentially just going to poke around a little bit. Let's say he does some random move. Probably just going to start working the king side pawns forward. He really can't move his pieces. His rook needs to protect this. His bishop needs to protect here. If he starts walking his king over, maybe he could do something like this, but then I'll hit this pawn, and then I can hit this pawn, and then I can pick up this pawn. He's just got too many weak pawns in the position. I think that's the real issue. So that would have been another, I guess in a sense, like in a safer way, you don't allow these trade of pawns, but the way that works out in the game is we still end up ahead of pawn quicker. So this way you'd have to be more confident in your calculation. If you weren't confident in calculating, you could just walk the king over and play the long game, which is still completely winning for black, but this is also completely winning as well. I think I would have probably leaned towards just taking the pawn, he takes, and then just like walking the king up the board. Something like this. Maybe rook f3 to protect the pawn. I don't know, maybe the king goes here, but I would eventually like work on pushing the pawn forward, get his rook stuck behind the pawn, and then move my king forward, and eventually work to promote the pawn. But in the game, he ended up resigning after he played rook a6, then ended up resigning because we're going to be ahead 2 pawns in a winning rook in game. So kind of an interesting game, weird, kind of interesting opening for sure. And then we are able to transfer this into this better in game, and then how we have this kind of long-term plan in the in-game. I want to take away his counterplay, reduce his pawn breaks on the queen side, attack the weak pawns that I kind of created for him earlier on in the game, and also try to negate as much counterplay as possible. Protect b6 once I played a5, try to take away bishop c6 checks, and not let him get to the 7th rank and stuff like that. So that's how I'm able to kind of maintain a big advantage throughout the game, win an extra pawn, and then the endgame is just about converting here. So that's it for this game, though. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell notification if you are interested in seeing more videos as they're uploaded. And I will see you in the next video then. Okay, bye everybody.